I welcome you to today's membership meeting. I would like to briefly introduce myself. My name is Preeti Kaur. I am a Global Director of Risk Management at AbbVie Pharmaceuticals. I've been a member of ISM since 2012 and have volunteered in multiple committees and roles. I am honored and humbled to be part of this organization. ISM has played a very important role within my professional growth. I have had the pleasure to grow with this organization, with the board of directors, committee chairs, trustees, and of course, our valuable members. I would like to thank our outgoing president, Deborah Augustus, for her leadership. She is leaving me with a big shoe to fill, but I can rely definitely on looking forward for my board of directors for their continued support. To say the least, I guess 2020 has been a very thought-provoking year for everyone globally. COVID pandemic has definitely taught us to be resilient, creative, survive in the new norms. We've somehow adapted to change without going through a formal change management. This is a time around in history, we all as global citizens are fighting the same battle. Personally, a lot has happened in my life in the first 6 months of 2020. As my former company, Allergan, got acquired by AbbVie, my work has brought new challenges with integration of two companies, getting acclimated with the new culture. And I started my executive MBA program from Brown IE University, which is a challenge in its own, given the circumstances that we're in. Additionally, I've assumed my passion of being involved in ISM New Jersey, which is very dear to my heart, and I'm hoping to bring great value. It isn't going to be possible without all the support and love that this organization gives us. So, as I said, I am going to lean on all the resources that are provided within this organization to make a successful tenure for me in the next 2 years. It's a big role to fill in. Without any further ado, I just want to get us started with today's event. Let me just share with you a couple of our upcoming events to keep everybody busy, even in virtually, and with interesting topics. So on June 24th, our upcoming event is actually, you can join us on a conversation with Joanne Martinez, who will be interviewing Jamie Crump. She is the president of the Richfield Group. This is about her first book entitled Backstage Pass, Pulling the Curtains Back on the Business of Supplier Diversity. This book is due to be released mid-July, so really can't wait to hear more about this, and excited. Our next event is actually spread over 3 different dates. It is our Supply Management Forum that usually happens in March, but because of course, COVID, we had to push it out. We are gonna, this is gonna be a virtual conference, and it will be featuring expert speakers on digital transformation. So the dates are actually July 22nd, July 29th, and August 5th. You can definitely register on our website at www.ismnewjersey.org, and you will find more information about these events on the website itself. So thank you. I hope this evening is going to be a wonderful evening with our panelists, our new members, and our existing members. So I'm now going to pass over to our membership director, Anu Rao, to introduce our new members. So Anu, all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Preeti, and wish you all the best. And I'm excited to have you as our president over the next 2 years. A lot of what I do at ISM, you are the one who first encouraged me to take a role in the various committees, and I'm excited for the next phase. With that, I would like to introduce the two newest members to ISM, Seth Dunn. Hi, Seth. And
How's it going?
Jacqueline Castro. Thank you
Hi.
so much, both of you. And with that, I'll pass it over to Jeffrey.
Good afternoon, everyone. Change management, certainly always a hot topic, but never more now than when everything we do, everything we've known is changing. The oft-forgotten human component of project success. Two great speakers today. There'll be fun facts about them at the end of the introduction. Patrick Baumgardner is with Corcentric. He's a senior consultant in their source to pay group. As a member of their advisory services division, he works with Corcentric's clients to enhance the maturity and performance of procurement and finance and to eliminate inefficiencies. He joined Corcentric last year and is the change management lead. He holds a BS degree in supply chain and information systems from one of the top 10 supply chain schools, Penn State. Prior to joining Corcentric, he spent 7 years within manufacturing in the roles such as senior demand planner, sourcing manager, and process manager. His colleague, John Sepcie, is an analyst within Corcentric's source to pay consulting group, contributing to their transformation and process refreshes across their entire client portfolio. John works alongside Patrick, supporting large-scale change management efforts as well as their supplier diversity advisory verticals. John has over 8 years of project management experience. In the last 5 years, he's focused primarily on procurement, specializing in source to pay and supplier contracting. Since I told you Patrick's education, John holds a bachelor's from Westchester University on the beautiful Main Line outside of Philadelphia. And he's an active contributor to the Strategic Sourcer blog, as well as contributing to Corcentric's website materials. Interesting, John and Patrick both started working for Corcentric on the same day last year. And two other fun facts, Patrick is an avid concert goer, his favorite band being the Red Hot Chili Peppers. We talked about this before the session started. And John wields a mean 6-string axe guitar. So gentlemen, I encourage everyone to post questions in the windows. Patrick and John will be monitoring and will answer your questions. Guys, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Well, Jeffrey, thank you so much. Appreciate that introduction. I'm going to be sharing my screen here, so I believe everyone should be able to see that. So, like Jeffrey said, we're from Corcentric, and we're going to talk about change management, which we candidly dubbed the oft-forgotten component or human component of project success. So just moving into it, a little bit of background about ourselves. I think Jeffrey gave us a great introduction, but just as far as some of what we do on a day-to-day, I kind of serve as a co-account lead for some of our large-scale engagements, as well as working in the past in supplier contracts and review. Patrick, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, John. So I think Jeffrey's introduction was pretty good. Thank you, Jeffrey. So as he noted, I'm the change management lead. And I don't want to repeat too much of what he said, so I'll just jump into it if we can move on to the agenda. So first off, I also want to take the time to thank everybody in attendance today for taking the time out of your schedules to join us. John and I are really excited about this topic, and we think it's going to provide a lot of practical value to everyone in attendance. So with that, let's cover the agenda. So we're going to start off today by providing a high-level overview and introduction into change management. After that, we will discuss the differences between change management and project management and why the two practices need to be integrated in order to achieve our target business outcomes. After that, we'll introduce some key concepts in change managements that are common amongst, key concepts and best practices that are common amongst change management, and discuss how they can be applied to better manage our procurement programs and increase the results of our strategic sourcing initiatives. After that, John will provide us some takeaways and we'll open it up for Q&A. All right, so some of you here today may be asking, what is change management? Change management is the application of a structured process and set of tools for managing the people side of change. Change management takes many forms, as you'll see on this screen. On a project level, change management is a process which can be used by project teams to manage the people side of system, process, and organizational changes. From an organizational standpoint, change management is both a competency which managers and business leaders can apply to help employees transition through periods of change, and it is also a strategic capability which organizations can use to increase their change capacity and accelerate the changes within their organization. So, how does change management work? Well, just like any process, change management involves inputs, which go through a transformational process in order to yield desired outputs. In the case of change management, the inputs are going to be whatever changes we are introducing to our technology, processes, organizational structure, or job roles. And the transformational process they're going to go through involves careful stakeholder and risk analysis, which will be leveraged to develop communication and stakeholder engagement strategies, targeted training plans, and reinforcement tactics to ensure that the changes are sustained over time. When all this is done properly and well planned out, the outputs are going to be that employees are going to adopt the change, employees will utilize this new solution, and employees will become proficient within their future state. And when all this happens, we're going to achieve those target business outcomes and business results we intended to go after in the first place. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John, who will provide a little additional detail about the types of deliverables included in the change management process.
Sure, thanks, Pat. So looking at what typically is involved in a change management project or process, one thing I do like to point out is that there's many common themes between change management and procurement. So change management really provides a strategic approach to ensure that the best practices are taken, and it's focused on the people side of change. And really the goal is to focus on that people side to ensure that there's adoption and utilization. So really, change management helps prevent the critical soft skills and strategies that are often overlooked from falling through the cracks. So how do we typically do this? Well, one of the first steps would be a risk analysis. And really, this risk analysis the goal is to determine the scale of change management needed. So from an organizational perspective, we're going to look at the change culture. So how does an organization respond to change? What's their competency level for change? And that's going to be looked at from the entire spectrum, all the way from executive level down to the end user. So when we look at a change specific process, we want to look at how large of an impact is being created through our processes, our policies, our tools. We're taking into consideration all of these as we're working through that. As we look at a stakeholder analysis, here we're going to identify all the stakeholder groups that are impacted. So using a standardized scoring system, we can grade the impact on each group, similar to what we do typically with maybe supplier scoring or bid scoring, something like that. But in this case, we're going to be focused on how our stakeholders are impacted, and in which case we're going to develop targeted plans and communications, which would bring us into the next component, which would be communication strategies and schedules. So the goal would be to plan out all of your key communications over the course of a project. You want to look at your topic, your message, your audience, and your sender. And really what's important to make sure that that is effective is active project sponsorship, that reinforcement from leadership. So that active sponsorship can be one of the biggest contributing factors to a successful change management program. So really you want to plan out that sponsor engagement. You want to plan out what activities you have. So we have the reinforcement from the appropriate management level. Moreover, we want to set up coaching programs for our change leaders. So these are going to be the managers of the end users. And we want to make sure we're preparing and guiding them through our change period so they understand the process. But moreover, we want to make sure that they're prepared for any resistance that they might experience from their employees, which would be what we look at as resistance management. We want to anticipate the types and sources of resistance and we want to come up with plans to proactively mitigate and respond to that. And the last two items would be training programs. So training programs for the end user. So whereas we set up coaching programs for the change leaders, we're going to establish training programs for the end users. And this can come from the change leader, from the manager, or we can set up an entire plan. But the goal being that we have trainings ready for our people when we get to that point when we're implementing the change. And lastly, but certainly not leastly, we have adoption and utilization metrics. We want to make sure that we have these satisfied, or we have these established, I should say, before we go live. So we want to make sure that we know what to measure, those important KPIs or those important measurables. We want to make sure we have them planned so we can actually take corrective plans throughout the entire course of a project. Basically, you want to make sure that you're flexible throughout the entirety of the project. Before moving on, I'm going to do a quick pause and see if there's any questions that have come through. I'm not sure if that's sharing on my screen or not. I'll move that over here. So some questions, Patrick, for you and I. So we have, what do we view as the most optimal ways to communicate the impending changes? So Patrick, if you want to handle that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So whenever possible, we want to handle changes face-to-face. Obviously, in circumstances like today's times, that can be difficult, but we need to look for opportunities to get creative. So instead of just blasting our organization with an email from our president or our COO, try to incorporate video conferences like this. We can get really creative and have, if you want to get really creative, you could even have a leader when introducing a change to the organization in the early communications, record a funny selfie video and send it out. Something that's really going to engage the stakeholders, get their attention, try to create excitement. So obviously there are times where simple email communications are the best, but it's important to note that when possible, we want to look for some sort of face-to-face communication.
And outside of just some of the optimal ways to communicate, when is typically the best time to begin communicating possible changes that an organization is going to say?
For the most part, as early and often as possible. If you're really concerned about creating, some sort of fear, or a particular change is going to foster a lot of resistance, then we may want to really carefully think about engaging stakeholders or external stakeholder suppliers at the right time. But for the most part, the earlier we introduce change, the better.
Great. Thank you, Seth, for those questions. So moving ahead, if we're going to look at some optimal times when to incorporate change management or when it might be useful. So just really in short, it's any and all initiatives that involve change. So it can be a process redesign or a process design in the first place. So if we're going to use some procurement examples or sourcing examples, if you're going to do a policy or process refresh, whether that's your SRM or your supplier diversity process, or you want to maybe look at your playbooks or SOPs, you need help drafting job roles or responsibilities. These are all going to be opportunities that you can really use a change management program on a small scale in individual projects, or on a larger scale, if you want to expand it to your entire team, you can. And we'll get in a little bit later as far as when the appropriate time to apply these, but just for some sourcing examples there. But also we have some tech implementations and upgrades. So anytime you're going to be implementing a new SaaS or a new software, or a P2P program or platform, these are going to be times that you want to consider some of the changes that are going to affect your team and some of the affected groups are going to be affected. So really an opportunity there would be a change management program. So, and I mentioned earlier, business model changes or process redesign. So really, if you have a supply chain model change, if it's changes from assembly to outsource, these would be times that you could use it. And then moreover, changes that impact either your suppliers or your customers. So these could be mergers and acquisitions, streamlining and unifying technology, roles and responsibilities within that merger or acquisition would be opportunities. And I do point out that I think that would be a perfect opportunity to use a large scale program, because you're not only dealing with one team, you're dealing with two teams or two organizations, I should say. With that, I'll do a quick pause. I know I had a break here for questions, but if we don't have any questions, I'll keep moving on. Doesn't look like there's any in the chat right now. So again, feel free to just type them as we go, and we'll stop when we see any come through. So kind of looking at how change management and project management differ, we want to look at maybe the focus and the approach for each of them. So Looking at project management, that's really the application of knowledge, skills, tools, and techniques to the project activities to meet the project requirements. So in which case your focus would be the task to achieve project requirements. So through the application and integration of project management processing. And you could do that through initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, closing. And just want to point out that that is from the Project Management Institute, the certifying body for project management. So that isn't necessarily our definition. So you may see some differences or variances across there. But when we look at change management, we want to look at that people side. So the process, tools, and techniques to manage the people side to achieve our target business outcomes. So we want to incorporate organizational tools that can be utilized to help individuals make successful personal transitions. So just the plan always being focusing on the end user, or really from the top down, everyone affected. And how do we do that? This would be Corcentric's approach. So this is how we view change management, but prepare, design, execute, and reinforce. So if we want to look at some individual tools for each, so project management, business cases, risk identification and mitigation, so reports on performance and compliance, your SOWs, things like that, all of these to meet the individual requirements, whereas change management would be communication plans, sponsorship programs, coaching and training, some of the things that we touched on earlier. I will do a quick pause. I think I saw a question come through, but I could be, yep. So how important is it to have someone from SLT on the change management team, Patrick?
What is SLT? Is that senior leadership, or I'm not sure.
That's like that question came in from Janine. Would if you wouldn't mind just expanding on that a little bit. Okay. And while we wait for that, just looking at our next slide here. So
okay,
you were right. Yep, senior leadership team.
Yeah, senior leadership team. So it's super important. So when we speak about project sponsors, we're talking about those leadership members, the executive management members who are sponsoring this change. So having them involved is very critical. And studies show that one of the most important factors in driving change management success is active and visible sponsorship. So they need to, whether or not they're on the team specifically, they need to be actively involved in the communication, engaging stakeholders, making sure that stakeholders visibly see that they're supporting this change.
Should they actively be on the task team, Patrick, or is that something that can maybe vary from each team, how you establish your team?
Yeah, that's going to vary. That's going to vary based on a lot of things. The specific nature of the change at hand, the organizational culture. Again, the big thing is that stakeholders see that the sponsors are supporting the change. So a lot of times, having sponsors on the change management team may get in the way if they don't have a strong change management competency. In those types of situations, it's, the change management team just needs to ensure that they're engaged and that all the stakeholders see that they're engaged in supporting the change. In other cases, it may be beneficial to have them on the change management team in order to make important decisions and ensure that things don't get slowed down. The person there able to provide the final say.
Okay. It looks like we had another one come in. So how important is it to have a personal touch when communicating change versus just jumping change announcements on like a SharePoint or an intranet site?
Super important. Personal, and we can talk about personal touch, and from two standpoints. One, we want to try to deliver the communications in a fashion that's as targeted as possible. So speaking to small groups wherever possible. Two, we want to do something different, as I mentioned. We want to try to get creative, come up with something more engaging than just delivering a communication by email or uploading it to SharePoint. We definitely want to make sure that we have some level of individual engagement or not necessarily individual, but we want to make sure that the stakeholders are trained so that they're prepared with the necessary knowledge and skills to succeed in the new system. We don't want to just drop a new SOP on SharePoint and not have any sort of engagement to walk stakeholders through it and let them know about the types of behaviors that they're going to need to change in order to succeed.
All right, great. Thanks for the question, Steph. Active group today, so I appreciate that. We always have questions.
Definitely.
So we looked at how they differ, taking a look at how these practices are related. So really, it's important to note that any change to process, systems, organizational structures, really job roles, anything, they're going to have both a technical and a people side. And it's important to note that both of these disciplines have kind of evolved to be structures and tools needed to manage and realize change successfully. So whether that be from a project perspective or a full organizational change perspective. So in order for an organization to be effective in developing and implementing change, you need to have project management and change management plans established and integrated throughout the entire life cycle of a process. So you can't just dump one in ad hoc as needed. Really, you need to have it established throughout the entire process in order for it to be most successful. So whereas the technical side, you're going to be focusing on designing and delivering. The people side, you want to focus on adoption and use. But ultimately, if you combine these two efforts and these two disciplines, that's how you're going to achieve your target business outcomes. And ultimately, as professionals, that's going to be our goal every single time. So I think it's just important to stress that using these two in tandem and creating synergies between the two of them is how you find the most success. And I'm sure it could be said about a lot of things, but it's really being flexible. And I think that's important to note. With that, again, we have the chat box open for any questions. Normally we would pause here, but I'm going to pass it over to Patrick, and he's going to discuss some of the key concepts and then how to apply them throughout the procurement lifecycle and in some sourcing initiatives as well.
Excellent. Thank you for that introduction, John. As John mentioned, I'm going to introduce some key concepts and best practices and discuss how we can apply them to better manage our procurement programs and increase the results of our strategic sourcing initiatives. So on this slide, you'll see 7 key concepts that are important to change management. I'm going to take some time now to discuss a few of them and discuss how they can be applied to procurement and sourcing. So the first concept I want to discuss is the idea of senders and receivers. And this concept is twofold, really. So the first half of this concept involves the idea that when it comes to messages about organizational change, what a sender says and what a receiver hears can be two very different things. So typically the sender is going to speak about business issues and the organizational reasons for needing to adapt. However, when the receiver first hears this message, they're going to process that information in terms of personal risks and implications on them. So, what we want to do here to try to eliminate this issue is we want to try to answer what's in it for me up front. And by that, I mean that we want to look to incorporate messaging about the positive impacts that are expected due to the change into early communications and stakeholder engagement. The second half.
I'm going to pause right there. We did have a question come in. So I like this question. Do most of your change management project teams meet daily? And to kind of piggyback on that, what would be a good recommendation for how often or the cadences in which you have certain meetings?
Yes, that's a great question as well. And that's also, so that's really gonna, depend on the circumstances, depend on the nature of the project, depend on the scope and reach of the change, whether it's a small change or whether it's a radical change. Is it impacting one business unit or is it impacting the entire organization? I would say meeting daily is a lot regardless of the circumstances. So I'm working on a project now that has a really huge scope. And we're meeting twice a week. Some weeks it's not necessary and we only meet once, but we always like to meet at least once a week to recap what the previous action items were and make sure they were achieved, discuss what's coming up next, and make sure that everybody's prepared to act on their deliverables. So that's really going to depend on the circumstances, but at least once a week. Again, 2 times a week is definitely not overkill.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm. All right, and then the second half of this concept of senders and receivers involves the idea that receivers have preferred senders for messages about change. So when it comes to information about organizational impacts and reasons for change, the preferred senders are leadership and executive management. When it comes to messages about how a change is going to impact stakeholders in terms of how they do their jobs on a daily basis, the preferred senders are direct managers and their supervisors. So with that, I'm going to move on to resistance management. And the thing we need to realize about resistance is that it is the natural reaction to change. And we simply just cannot underestimate the power of comfort with how things are done today. So even when you hear your coworkers or colleagues complain about a current system or technology, the reality is that when faced with change, the vast majority of them are going to resist due to those personal implications and risks that we just mentioned. So in closing, when what we need to take away from resistance is that while it cannot be eliminated, we need to take steps to proactively anticipate and eliminate it. And then the last key concept I want to touch on this slide is the right answer and the correct answer. So the thing we really need to realize here is that simply having the correct answer is not always enough. In order to obtain stakeholder buy-in, employees must be involved. And as I mentioned earlier, the earlier we start to engage them, the better. For example, we may have all the right reasons for wanting to switch a supplier, but if we do not involve key stakeholders and receive their buy-in, they're going to resist. They're going to find ways to buy off contracts. So that brings this slide to a close. Do we have any questions before I discuss how to apply these for procurement?
Doesn't look like we have any questions at the moment. I'm moving ahead.
John, there's one
Oh,
from Hermont.
okay, so so could we provide actual examples implemented? So how the situation, the task, action, and results. Pat,
Yes.
yeah, we want to keep that in mind. Yeah.
So on the next slide, we're going to discuss how these can be applied to procurement, and then on the following slide, how they can be applied to strategic sourcing. So on this slide, you'll see I've listed 3 areas of procurement that can greatly benefit from the change management concepts we discussed. And next to each, I discussed specifically the change management concepts and best practices that provide the most value. So right now, I want to discuss specifically how these concepts can increase the performance of our stakeholder engagement. So when it comes to stakeholder engagement, the first change management concept we want to keep in mind is the right answer versus the correct answer. And again, the big thing here is making sure we take all the necessary steps to ensure that we engage as many stakeholders as possible. And when engaging with our stakeholders about new procurement policies or a sourcing event, the earlier we engage them for input, the more likely we are to receive their compliance. And this ties directly into resistance management. So if stakeholders feel they have some sort of ownership in the outcome, they're going to be far more likely to come out satisfied and comply with the change. And then lastly, on the last slide, if you recall, I mentioned that when it comes to introducing changes to an organization, there needs to be 2 levels of change management communication that are delivered. So first, we need those executive leaders to deliver information about the organizational reasons for change. And then we need managers and supervisors to be meeting with their teams, the individual employees on their teams, to discuss how the change is going to impact them. So consider this example. Your organization is getting ready to implement a new procure-to-pay software along with stricter P-card controls. So the first communication about this change should come from the leader of the procurement department and should be focused on the expected benefits, such as a more streamlined process, increased visibility, and increased spend under management. The managers of the various business units impacted should then be scheduling meetings with their team members to discuss at a more granular level how this change is going to impact their jobs and their daily roles, and also provide them assurance that support is going to be provided to help them transition through the current, from the current state to the future state. So if we take the necessary steps to apply these concepts when engaging with our stakeholders, we're going to be far more likely to get the results we are hoping for with considerably less resistance.
Pat, it looks like we did have one come in. I'm not sure if you touched on it as I was reading this, but when changing suppliers, it's sometimes top-down driven. So regardless of what the stakeholder wants, how should changes like that be shared? And I did hear you might have touched on some of this, but if you wanted to take that.
Yeah, true. So there's not always going to be circumstances where stakeholders can necessarily be engaged for input, but at the very least, we need to inform them that the change is coming, so that we can start to assure them that this is being done for positive reasons. This is going to create positive impacts for our business, and there are reasons for doing this. So, whenever possible, we want to engage them to try to secure their buy-in. But of course, there's certain instances where that's just not going to be possible. And the key there is just going to be to, again, just keep them informed about the changes coming, the suppliers and categories that are going to be impacted, and when they can expect these changes. And sometimes reinforcement comes in the form of just telling stakeholders that they need to comply, or find another way to deal with it, right? So, and that's when having the, sometimes our sponsors need to come in and have that more authoritative presence and just inform stakeholders that this is how it's going to be done because it's best for the business, and the situation has been carefully mapped out and planned.
Great, thanks.
Sure. All right. So on this slide, we are looking at a summary of the benefits that change management can bring to the table when applied to the procurement function overall. So when we apply these change management concepts and best practices to the daily running of our organizations, some of the benefits that we're going to expect or will receive within the procurement department are going to be stronger supplier relationships and improved supplier performance. Improved policy compliance amongst our stakeholders, better stakeholder engagement and participation, which again, as we mentioned, is going to lead to reduced stakeholder resistance. More efficient work environments and cross-functional communications, reduced supply chain disruptions, and increased success achieving our goals and KPIs. Does anybody have any questions before I discuss this next slide?
Nothing in the chat right now, Pat. I'll stop you if something does come through.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, so on this slide, we are looking at a few of the change management tools that improve stakeholder compliance when integrated into the strategic sourcing process. So out of the 4 deliverables listed here, developing and executing against a strong communications plan is the most essential. When we're preparing for a sourcing initiative, we need to be certain that we carefully craft a communication strategy that engages stakeholders at the appropriate times. And another change management best practice that we can look to incorporate is including feedback mechanisms to acquire that stakeholder input. So the first communication we should be looking to send in the strategic sourcing process is something to notify stakeholders that a change to our supply base is coming and specify the categories that are going to be impacted. And this initial communication is also a great opportunity to include a requirements form of some sort to gather that stakeholder input and gain information about important specifications that whatever supplier we ultimately select for the product or service, that they're going to be able to meet those needs. The next big part of the process where we need to ensure that we communicate and engage stakeholders is during the supplier identification and selection process. And as we noted on the last slide, it's not necessarily always going to be feasible, and it's not going to make sense to involve stakeholders for input, but when possible, we should involve those key stakeholders for input about, supplier identification, suppliers to include, or ultimately the selection. But at the very minimum, we need to advise when the decision is made. So, but in summary, when it comes to applying communications plans to strategic sourcing initiatives, the most important part is that it is vital when we get ready to deliver well planned out communications once contracts are finalized. So stakeholders need to know what suppliers we're going into contracts with, what suppliers we're no longer going to be purchasing from, a final list of the categories and items in scope, and when the contracts take effect. So when we take the time to fuse change management into our strategic sourcing approach, it's going to greatly improve the likelihood that we're able to deliver on the projected savings. And with that, I'm going to move on to the next slide unless there are any questions.
Nothing open right now.
Awesome. So in summary, what benefits is applying change management to the strategic sourcing process going to produce? Well, when we take the necessary steps to incorporate change management best practices and the key concepts that we have discussed, that is going to result in reduced stakeholder resistance and increased contract compliance, which will in turn reduce savings leakage and result in less rogue spend. When we develop targeted stakeholder plans, such as the communications plans, training plans, and resistance management plans that we talked about, this is going to result in increased adoption, utilization, and user proficiency within the new state. And ultimately, that is going to accelerate our path to ROI. And the bottom line is that change management is a powerful mechanism for cost avoidance, risk management, and achieving our target business outcomes. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John, who is going to wrap up the presentation with some key takeaways before we move on to the Q&A.
Sure, thanks, Pat. So like Pat said, we kind of just the key takeaways that we want everyone to walk away from with today is that, there's certain parts of the process of a change management program or process, and really the 4 important things would be the people, the integration, and one thing we want to call out would be the accelerated ROI you can achieve, and then also the adoption at which people will, or the accelerated adoption, I should say. So really, change management is going to be the application of a structured process and set of tools managing the people side. It drives success by supporting individual transitions, and for an organization to be effective, we recommend implementing both change management and project management tools and strategies at your disposal throughout the entirety of a project. And really ingraining change management into procurement operations would lead to stronger supplier relationships, improved policy compliance, reduced stakeholder resistance, and increased success achieving your goals and KPIs. So when applying change management to strategic sourcing initiatives, we want to call out that when done right, your savings, you can reduce your savings leakage and accelerate that time to that ROI. And really the bottom line is change management is a powerful mechanism for avoiding unnecessary costs, minimizing risk, and achieving target business outcomes. And I think we all know right now, as far as the heightened exposure to risk and things like that, it's important to maybe consider some of these options. And Patrick, it looks like we did have one question come in there. So Janine posted this. In her experience, no matter how much you have senior management involved, there is still tolerance for allowing end users to continue using non-awarded suppliers. What do you recommend, or what tricks of the trade can you share to maybe reduce some of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would agree that there always needs to be some sort of tolerance level, and usually a lot of organizations control that with their P-card policies. So I think the big thing here is that as an organization, we need to do the best to ensure that when there are contracts in place, that we buy off of them. But in situations where an item does not fall, into a contract necessarily, stakeholders can use their P cards if they have that, or they can submit a request for procurement to purchase from a given supplier, and procurement will make the decision whether or not that's in violation of a contract in place.
So with that, would you say there's almost like a little bit of not necessarily leeway, but you do need to have a little bit of that give and take a little bit, to not necessarily allow it to happen or turn a blind eye, but have that flexibility to assume that some of these off catalog purchases might happen, things like that, for example?
Yeah, I think it's inevitable. Again, this isn't necessarily resistance, but when we spoke about the resistance, we mentioned the concept that there's really no way to completely eliminate it, but we need to take steps to proactively try to anticipate that and mitigate it. So we can never completely control it, but the best we can do is to try to put communications out there to stakeholders about the reasons for the change, and try to have our sponsors and leadership teams and managers enforce them. So
Patrick, it's Jeffrey. If I could tag off of that question, can't you put restrictions on the P card and limit people's ability to buy off contract with a non-approved vendor? Because the reason we give awards to vendors is they give us best pricing.
right.
And part of that pricing is based on volume. So I'm going to buy 100,000 widgets from you this year, and you're going to give me a 40% discount off a list. If I do another 10,000 above that, I get an extra couple of points. But if I fall below, I got to rebate some of that discount. End users aren't necessarily concerned with that. They want what they want.
Mm-hmm.
But we as a business need to lead and say, there is a reason why we are doing these policies.
Right. Agreed. 100%. Yeah. And I think you mentioned the limits on the P card. So that's a great way to control it, is to just have reasonable limits on them that are going to prevent employees from making the purchases. But yeah, I think that's a great point, and thank you for assisting with addressing that, Jeff.
Not a problem. So I know we are not a shy group of people, and there are still 49 people on the call with us. What else does somebody want to bring up and talk about? Use the Q&A or the chat box, please.
Chat box is still open right now, I believe. You know what, Patrick, I'll submit one. using some of your experience, what would you say that some of the biggest challenges you face as somebody who's a change management professional when coming into a new project?
Great question. So some of the biggest challenges I would say would face would just be getting an understanding of the organization's culture and capacity for change. You know, focusing specifically on my work within change management, leading that function within the projects. You know, it's really easy to scope out the project and what it's going to involve and the changes that it's going to introduce in terms of the processes and systems that stakeholders are using. But a big part in developing the appropriate change management strategy is going to be understanding how that organization responds and manages change. So our sponsors are, you know, our managers, good sponsors and effective change leaders. Our middle management good change leaders? Do the employees typically respond well to change? Are employees typically rewarded for pursuing innovative changes and exhibiting behaviors that show change? So all these kinds of things that you know, are going to impact how change is done and managed within a particular organization. Another thing that we need to look to get an understanding of is, you know, are there other changes occurring? So the more changes that are occurring at a single time, the more change management that's going to be needed, the more resistance that's going to be expected. So I would say it's getting a feel for those, you know, unique organizational traits and the current amount of change capacity that may be available.
And it looks like we did have a couple of questions come in to the Q&A here. So how do you monitor compliance to the change? So I think that's a great question. What are some measurables maybe?
Yeah, great question. So when it comes to change management, there's not really going to be like the same types of KPIs that there are for procurement, right? There's not going to be any like change under management or you know, procurement cycle time. But we really want to do is just track that adoption and utilization. So if let's just say we implemented a new software, we're going to know how many business users there are, because that's going to be part of the stakeholder analysis. So what we're then going to do is run reports within the technology to see how many users are using it. We can get it down to an exact number of users and an exact percentage. Another great way is to deliver some sort of surveys. You know, getting surveys and just outright asking suppliers, you know, or I'm sorry, employees, not necessarily about adoption, but utilization. Ask them, you know, are you utilizing this solution or process to its, you know, fullest capacity? Do you need additional support or training in order to, you know, fully be able to leverage it to its value?
Great. It looks like we had another one come in. Do you think it's worth getting the ADKAR certification for change management, so the ADKAR certification?
Yes, I do. I think it's a great program. Yeah, it's, you know, really fantastic. I would say it really provides you a great foundation for what change management is, and understanding the basic theories and concepts of change. You know, when it gets to the point where if you're looking to develop your change management practices, that's not included in the basic certification. So you'll need to go into additional programs, which of course they'll charge for. But in terms of just providing a really strong foundation for what change management is and how, you know, how it needs to be delivered, it's a great program.
So Patrick, we in ISM have our certifications. Other supply chain organizations have theirs. John mentioned PMI earlier for project managers. I'm not familiar with ADKAR. Could you just talk a little bit about it and maybe post an address on where people can get more information if they'd like to delve into that?
Yeah, that's a great idea. Let me make a note of that, actually. But yeah, so ADKAR is an acronym, and it's a model for individual change, which was developed by ProSci. And ProSci is a leading organization for helping companies develop change management competencies. So as I mentioned, it's an acronym, and ADKAR stands for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. And what those represent are the 5 levels of change that individuals need to go through in order to successfully transition from the current state to the future state and to be able to effectively operate in that future state. So the first thing that needs to happen for individuals to change is that they need to be made aware of the changes, that the change is happening, how it's going to impact them, how it's going to, you know, change their role within the organization. next thing we need to do is develop and foster some sort of desire within the stakeholders, make them, come to that decision that they're going to not resist and that they're actively going to participate. Next, we need to equip them with all the knowledge that they'll need in order to succeed in the future state. And after that, we need to train them. We need to develop the skill sets that they'll need in order to successfully operate within new processes, to use new technology, to deal with new customers or suppliers, a new supply chain model, whatever that may be. And the last element of it is that there needs to be that organizational reinforcement, right? So ultimately, stakeholders need to realize that if they're not interested, if they're not gonna, if personally they're not interested, they still need to. They need, and that reinforcement comes from management, and it can also be in a positive way, right? So another way to encourage change is to celebrate wins, and pulling one out of the psychology textbook, little positive reinforcement. So when employees exhibit behaviors that demonstrate change, their managers should come by and thank them, congratulate them, say, hey, great job. So so ADKAR is representative of the 5 levels of change that an individual needs to go through in order to successfully transition into the future state.
Looks like we had another one come through. Do you think it's important to share with stakeholders early on the actual steps to change management?
So, the actual steps, I don't think they really need to understand the concept at like a very finite level, but it's important as early as possible to ensure them and provide them with information about the particular change management strategy that's going to be utilized on this project to help them, develop the skills and knowledge that they need in order to succeed, right? Because again, a big reason for resistance is that stakeholders fear, they fear those personal implications and risks. So, I'm really good at my job today using this technology. What if I'm not as good using this new software? And, that results with putting me in a less favorable position or impacts my bonus or something like that. So it's important that we communicate with them as early as possible and with as much detail as possible what we're going to do to support them through that transition period, because that's going to go a long ways in neutralizing that resistance and securing their buy-in, getting them excited, engaging them in a positive way and making sure that they want to, creating that desire that they're going to want to participate in this change and be a part of it.
Okay, great. Another question we had is, one typical issue during this change is the high number of requests for proposals and low decisions once they are submitted. I'm not sure, Joyce, exactly what you mean by this change. Patrick, I'm not sure if you wanted to take a stab or if you wanted a clarification. I'm
looking at it now. One typical issue during this change is the high number of requests for proposals and low decisions once. Yeah, I'm not, I don't understand. Joyce, if you could clarify what situation we're referring to, or.
And then it looks like another one that came through was, do the PMA courses and certification cover the change management aspects discussed here today?
And PMA, I'm guessing that's some sort of project management certification. I'm guessing, but no, I don't think they would cover change management.
Gotcha. And Joyce's question was, during COVID-19, there are requests and very few decisions. That's what I thought she meant. Yep.
Okay. During COVID, there are requests and very few decisions to proceed on projects. I am a supplier. Okay, so one typical issue during COVID is the high number of requests for proposals and low decisions once they are submitted. Okay. Got it. So I understand it. What is really the question we're asking with that, though? So I understand that during the COVID period, we're getting, suppliers maybe getting a lot of RFPs, potential customers, prospects are asking for information, but not necessarily acting on the deals. But is there a question about how change management might be able to support that?
Great question. How does a supplier influence better decision making? So.
Oh, okay. That's a great question. So, I think the best procurement organizations rely on their suppliers to be subject matter experts, right? So in general, I think it's the job of the supplier to provide all the information you have as the subject matter experts on whatever product or service you're looking to deliver, and, develop the best sales pitch possible as well. yeah, I mean, I think that, suppliers are a tremendous, can provide a tremendous source of influence.
Yeah, and to piggyback off that back a little bit, Patrick, I think that one area or one aspect of maybe change management that we could apply to that is that communication piece of it. And I know from my experience with negotiating with suppliers and things like that, more of my experiences have been the suppliers who are willing to ask questions without necessarily prodding, and asking if there's anything else they would be interested in from a buyer's perspective or things like that. So just kind of using some of those concepts as far as understanding your sender and receiver, and also understanding that communication is key. Outside of that, the current climate and situation we're in right now, I can understand why it would be tough to make decisions.
Right, and yeah, that's a good point, John. So again, referring back to those change management concepts we discussed, one that I listed that didn't necessarily touch on was value systems. So, and by that we mean, being transparent with whoever the stakeholder is. So whether it's, a supplier communicating with a potential customer or vice versa, the best way that we're going to cut to the chase and come to a mutually beneficial solution is by being transparent about what our value systems are. So, if from the customer perspective, if they're asking for a cost reduction, what you want to do is bring to the table, the whole story. What are the, due to COVID-19, our supply chain's under a crunch right now. We really value your business, and we, appreciate the commitment and service levels that you've shown us over the years, but right now management is applying a lot of pressure for us to produce cost savings. Is there any sort of way you can lower your prices and be flexible again? So like a big part of change management is the willingness to be flexible. Let's say maybe if a supplier is able to reduce their pricing, maybe we give them more optimal payment terms, or commit to a longer term agreement or something like that. And from the supplier side, if you're trying to sell a client, tell them exactly why you think, your business is going to be a good fit, and why you're specifically focusing on targeting a specific type of customer in order to grow your business. So I think that's valuable information that is, and again, when we're transparent with these value systems, I think it goes a long way to reaching agreements and building trust.
With that, I do see we are 2 minutes to the hour. Jeffrey, I'm not sure if there's anything else that we wanted to touch on, or if not, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you much. I just want to thank both John and Patrick for their time, and really, really good conversation and presentation. Will we be able to share the slides with our participants?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay,
absolutely. So we'll get a copy over to you. Yep.
Look for that along with the continuing education credit. I look forward to seeing everybody at our next meeting. I believe it is next week. Have a great, safe day, and be careful out there. Thanks all.
Yep. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.